I told you that for me, January is a very meaningful time because it was 6 years ago that God brought me and allowed me to come and preach for the first time at First Baptist in Far. And for that year, all the way 2013 until about 2 or 3 months into 2014, I transitioned from an interim, which means transitional interim, to a permanent pastor. So the church called me as an interim for about 1 year and 3 months, and then the church invited me to become the pastor of the church. And in this transition, after 6 years of being here and going through the January experience of preaching or teaching the core values of the church, I have come to the conclusion that I'm always an interim. I mean, although I'm not an interim, but I am an interim. And the reason is because eventually somebody is going to have the mic and is going to speak to you guys. Eventually somebody is going to be sitting in your place. What's the point? No one is permanent. No one is permanent. Every one of us we're just transients. Now, in the scriptures, you find the concept of succession or transitioning very intentionally. See, for us, it's no accident that we're choosing the writings primarily from a guy that he saw himself as interim. In his case, his name is Paul. In his case, he's writing, he's speaking, he's preaching as an apostle. So he's speaking with authority. And one of the reasons why he speaks and he writes is because the churches that he was writing to, they're struggling to make this transition. They're struggling to really create the model that Jesus created. Think about Jesus. When Jesus shows up to this earth, and at age 30, he begins an earthly ministry. And in this ministry, he creates a succession ministry. He chooses 12 individuals to carry on the mission. So when you go to Acts chapter 1 and you see the ascension of Jesus, he's going up to heaven. He gives them the Great Commission, and he basically empowers them to create something that passes on the gospel. Well, the churches in this time in history, they were struggling to do this. So from week number 1, we talk about the church in Colossae, in the book of Colossians, and we basically said that for Paul, this whole concept is based on Jesus, is based on the behavior of Jesus, and the combination of what Jesus said about himself, and what Jesus did for 33 years. When you combine those, that's what we're supposed to be and do. The challenge for these churches that he's writing to, and we're going to go through multiple churches, Colossae, we're going to go to the Ephesians, the churches in Ephesus, and then we're going to close today with the writings of Peter, another apostle. The problem they were facing for multiple reasons is that instead of beginning with Jesus and then adopting the lifestyle of Jesus, these churches make the mistake to begin with themselves. So think for a second, as a single person that you might be today, maybe you are married, maybe you're a grandparent, whoever you are. The invitation of knowing Christ is that you do not begin with yourself. That we don't begin with ourselves. That 2019 is not the year that we just kind of rediscover who we are and come to the realization of my background and my dream moving forward. Those things are important, and I'm not against what you think and how you dream and where you've been in the past. Our conversation must be based not on ourselves, not on what we think the church should be, could do, should do. We must begin with Jesus. So Paul, speaking to these churches, he basically says Jesus is the head, and we are the body. That's plain and simple. Obviously, the previous verses of Colossians chapter 1 through 17, if you remember, if you were here, we spoke of the supremacy of Jesus over the cosmos, Lord of every single thing, creation itself. And Paul transitions from lordship over creation to lordship over the church. Well, this transition implies that he is the beginning, he is the firstborn, supremacy, and the thing that we did not expect, I don't think this church has expected, was the concept of supremacy through deadness, supremacy through sacrifice. We typically think exactly the opposite. I mean, think about tomorrow's holiday. Some of you are going to be off tomorrow. Some of you, may have to work tomorrow, but tomorrow, MLK, right? And it's about, trying to avoid abuse, trying to bring into equality and trying to bring the civil rights from which we benefit today. But ironically, the gospel kind of moves in the opposite direction. Apparently, the gospel is that those who want to be at the beginning, want to be first, those who want to experience the concept of moving forward is ironically through giving. through sacrifice, through the opposite of what we typically think. Well, here is the thing that we described a couple of weeks ago. We describe as well that in all these things, the purpose is that in everything, through us joining Jesus in his sacrifice, he might be supreme. He might be exalted. So the win is not that we just simply come along and we become the body. The win is that he is supreme over every single thing. Last week, we began speaking not just simply on Jesus himself, but now his behavior. And for us, the behavior of Jesus was represented through church membership. We just went through water baptism. For us as a church, it's a requirement for you to become a member. So if you have never been baptized by immersion, believer baptism, we don't believe that you can be a part of the body of Jesus locally. You're a part of the body of Jesus universally because you might be a Christian, which I hope and you are. But in this case, the purpose of this baptism, the purpose of this membership, which is the same reason why you belong to a family, is marriage, family, parenting, having parents or grandparents allows you to move away from your personal preferences into Christ-likeness. So when you join the family of God, it's not simply that you can avoid hell and get a better version of your life and avoid the mistakes of the past. Hopefully those things happen. But the purpose is that as you are on earth and as you are pursuing Christ-likeness, this is the group of individuals that through a covenantal relationship that is unbreakable, okay, is where you find that your relationship with God goes side to side, hand in hand, and it is unbreakable with your relationship with others. So there is not such a thing as you and I relating to God at an individual level and then picking, or simply disregarding how I relate to others. So what Paul is finding in these churches is that they were struggling on relating to one another, but they thought or they said that they were relating to God anyway. So in this case, for us, again, going to water baptism from last week, water baptism exemplifies this membership because symbolically you go underwater. We call this the water grave. You go underwater for the purpose to symbolize that once you die and join Jesus in his death is when you create a relationship with God. Otherwise, watch this. Otherwise, if you do not go through your spiritual burial, if you do not go through the symbolism of your burial, the tendency is going to be that instead of relating to God or making a covenant, you try to see God as a cosmic butler. You call on God whenever you need him. And God is merciful enough that he will come and respond to your prayers. But you and I know that whether it's marriage, work-related, parenting, there is no way I can have kids or a wife that only calls me when they need me. Tracking? The beauty is not that I can supply their needs or they can meet my needs. The beauty is the relationship. So the same thing happens with God. Well, when the individual comes out of the water, we said last week, it's for the purpose now that he comes out of the water. And the purpose has to do with coming into in this case, a relationship, and not only with God, but now is with each other. So this morning, when we celebrated water baptisms, the individual came out of the water not simply as a brand new person, but he came into a brand new covenant, and that's the local church. Today, what I want us to do, I want us to move beyond this, and again, just touching base on what happened last week, we spoke on how you do this. And Paul gives us the ideals through the book of Ephesians, which is a church that is also struggling to put these things together. It's a church that is conveniently divorcing the experience of immersion with the experience of coming out of the water. People were okay with joining God and becoming one with God, but when it came to becoming one with one another, because they were Jewish and they were Greeks and they were Romans, and their skin color and the languages and their personal preferences, it was a disarray. It was crazy. So Paul, what he does after the Colossians, he writes to the Ephesians, and if you were to read chapters 1 through 3, the problem with Ephesians is that separation, that division among themselves, is that chapters 1 through 3 that we do not have the time to read is the unity, not of the church, but the unity of the Father with the Son, the Father with the Spirit with the Son, the unity among the triune God. What's the point? Here's the point. Here's the point. That for you and I to experience the unity that we need on a Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, when you look at the division or just the breaking of society, it's not that we can just get homogeneous, mindsets and just people that can get along. We have to embrace the unity of the triune God. So if God and His supremacy through the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is not overpowering my thinking, my preferences, my desires, my dreams, Paul says this is not a quick fix. In the meantime, as he goes into chapter 4, he says, let me tell you what this looks like. It looks like Jesus himself, Jesus, only Jesus. Not me, not somebody else, not the church, not the government. Jesus instituted, gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, and pastors. We simply said that this is the structure that God utilizes to create that unity. What does that mean? Here's what it means, and I'm gonna skip a couple of things because you guys can go into the website and look at the sermons. The purpose of this calling, this giftedness, and by the way, just so I can get that out of the system, out of the way, because sometimes I get a little nervous with this terminology. When the Bible describes the concept of apostles and the concept of prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, and this is kind of a little bit of I guess, some sort of a differences theologically, but on Friday, I was supposed to speak at a 50th wedding anniversary, and I'm always excited to join those anniversaries. And when we look at the address and we got there, we didn't know that the place had 2 ballrooms. Literally 2 ballrooms, separated, but they were one single building with one on the side and one on the other extreme of the building. So obviously, your pastor walks into the wrong one. That's obvious, right? There's no way. I mean, I didn't know any better. So I walk into the place, and literally when you open the door, there is a people. Like there is no lobby, you open it, there's the people. And there was someone at front with a microphone, and literally as we walk into the place, the person said, and now we want to welcome the prophet. And I was like, it begins with a P because I'm a pastor, but that's the wrong P. It's the other P, not the prophet. See, we found out later, well, I noticed that it was the wrong gathering. It was a church anniversary, but some churches, they believe they have prophets, they have apostles. I don't believe we have them. And I'm going to tell you why I don't believe we have the offices of prophets and apostles. If you look at Paul, going back to Paul as an apostle, his writings begin by saying, Paul, servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle. There are 3 signs or 3 requirements for someone to be an apostle, as in Peter and John and these guys, the 12, including Paul. Number 1, you have to be a part of Jesus' earthly ministry. You have to walk with Jesus. Secondly, you have to be an eyewitness of the resurrection. That's the second requirement. And the third one, you have to be commissioned by Jesus. If he doesn't commission you, you're not an apostle. Well, Paul writes a bunch of these letters defending, because obviously he did not participate on the previous 2. He only had the calling, road to Damascus, and which is obviously the most important one. All that I'm trying to tell you is that when you see the list of these apostles and prophets, and he gives us in Ephesians, I want to remind you, and you know this, but again, the Me Too movement, equality, the role that women play in church, at home, single moms. I mean, how do you do this? Am I supposed to submit to my husband? What does that mean? All these conversations, they're scriptural. What's the point? That the red circle implies leadership, which implies it's simply function. It's the function that the individual has in the organization, not necessarily the value or the worth. So value and worth, every one of us, everyone who is a brand new believer in Jesus, anybody that has experienced the birth of a brand new life in Jesus falls into one of the categories as a gift. Some of you are gifted in the conveying of the scriptures, as a teacher, as a preacher, is the gift of prophecy. The apostolic movement is simply those who have been sent, and in the announcements we'll go into detail. But if you look at outside, all those flower arrangements that were presented last week through the mission project in Chiapas, South Mexico, it has to do with the Diaz family, which is obvious. They have the gift of apostleship. They're missionaries. Wouldn't you agree? They go, which by the way, the project last week begun, $1,000. They need 10 pews, $100 each pew. We have $1,000 because you guys are so generous. Just in 1 week, God bless this ministry. But that's the gift of apostleship. I mean, that's what he's talking about. The distinction is not in essence, it's in function. Now, here is why we need to understand this, is that this whole concept of the apostleship and, the gift of prophecy and things like that is for the purpose to do what? Because apparently the churches in Ephesus, the churches in Colossae, the churches that we're describing, they were exactly the opposite. What's the opposite of being equipped? It's simply prideful. I know exactly what I'm doing. I don't have to listen to you. I know you are from a different, making excuses why you don't become teachable. Well, the Bible describes that teachability is simply the result of community. And this teachability has to go beyond just simply knowing better, but it's for a lifestyle of service. So again, Friday night, when I finally got to the right ballroom and I was able to be with the 50th, wedding anniversary deal. Can you imagine 50 years of marriage where the common denominator was a teachable husband and a teachable wife? Can you imagine raising a generation of young men and women, your kids and my kids and your grandkids, that they are known not by their knowledge, not their experience, but a generation who want to be equipped? And then translate it into a life of service. Can you imagine 50 years of marriage that the one thing that described their marriage is simply serving one another? That would be crazy, wouldn't it? Can you imagine a generation of men and women in the church that the body of Christ, the main purpose is so we can literally build things up versus what's the opposite? Apparently, the churches in Ephesus, they were tearing things apart because they were having a mindset of not service, but serve me for the purpose, not so I can learn, but so you can simply affirm what I already believe. Not fun, not good. Well, he closes by saying this, until, here's the win, is that everyone, and again, this is so offensive in this time in history, because Jewish people were okay to deal with non-Jewish people as long as the non-Jewish people became Jews, right? So people were compromising their personal preferences as long as they came on top. Paul says, it's everyone. From the oldest to the youngest, from the Jew to the Greek to the Roman, from the men to the women to the children. He says everyone must reach what? See, unity is not the absence of differences. Unity is when people, the body of Christ, men and women, married, single, they embrace what Jesus believed and what Jesus knew. So look at me for a second. If you were to come to me and speak to me about your life and your journey and your problems and your difficulties and your dreams and your sorrow and all these things that you're going through in life, here is what I'm going to have to tell you. Here's what I will definitely share with you. I can listen, we can cry, we can laugh, we can pray. But at the end, the win in your life to experience the unity, the bonding of the Holy Spirit is when you and whoever else is in your life embraces what Jesus believed and what Jesus knew. So if you're single this morning, the beauty of your singleness is that you get to choose the person that will raise your children one day by embracing somebody that believes not simply what you believe, but believes what Jesus believes. Tracking what I'm saying? It's not simply about what you know, but it's what Jesus knows. So once again, if you're single and you're dating somebody with a different belief system, not to you, but to Jesus, with a different knowledge, not to you, but to Jesus, I will say, run like the wind away from that relationship. Because trust me, it's going to come around and you're going to need a man or a woman that in your life that is going to be teachable, that is going to serve, and ultimately that builds things up. Well, Paul is going through this and he simply says, hey, here's the thing. So we can all become mature and we can experience Christ in its fullness. This fullness of Jesus, obviously, again, is reflected through family unions. You want to see God in everything you do. And here's the bottom line. And again, translate this into your family, translate this into the church. I just told you that the red circle implies function, not essence. Just because mom and dad are in charge, doesn't mean that they are better than the children. Does that make sense? They just have a different function. Please listen to me for a second. This is important. Somebody in the family is leading. Somebody in the family is setting the agenda. In today's culture, is really difficult to see who is leading sometimes. Sometimes is the mom, sometimes is the dad, sometimes is the other dad, and sometimes is the kids, and sometimes is the grandkids. But somebody's leading, right? Well, obviously, God sets an agenda, sets a structure, not to control us, but to protect us. And in this case, please listen to this. In this case, these individuals, which is the mother and the father, in the family nucleus, their role is to understand that the purpose of this role is to experience the fullness of Jesus, maturity, so everybody in the unity of the family can believe what Jesus believed and know what Jesus knew. That's the purpose. So in this context of this unity is where I want you to translate this into the life of the church. And in the life of the church, there is people that have been equipped, called, that they've been trained, or they have been placed in the position of leadership in the context that the leadership is for a covenantal relationship. The Bible describes those as elders, pastors, bishops, and deacons. It's the same word, just with different meanings. So here's what I want you to look at for a second with me. This is on your handouts. Who are these people? Who are these guys that they are within that red circle in the life of the church? Well, the Bible describes this. This is Peter speaking to the churches, and here's how he describes. Those are the guys that, based on Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, he says, here's a trustworthy saying. The individuals on the red circle, those who are going to lead the church, they have to do what? They have to have the feelings, the thinking, the desire that Jesus had. So whoever is leading the church, if their thinking, emotions, desires do not line up with Jesus, they cannot be a part of this. Does that make sense? It has to be with a brand new way of desiring and thinking. This is what you would call an overseer desires a noble task. And then look at what that means. Those desires needs to be someone that is above reproach. Someone that is faithful to the wife. Not that the individual has to be married, but if the individual is married, must be faithful to the wife. Has to be temperate, has to be self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and eventually able to teach. Now, look at me for a second. Here's what I want you to understand or see in this passage. Look at how the description of those who desire, those who have this desire to do this, those who aspire to do this has to do with character. The very last one of the list has to do with giftedness. So I'm going to say this again. Translate this into relationships. When you select an individual to date, eventually to marry, my suggestion is that you base that selection based on character, not necessarily on giftedness. Because in the Bible, those who will lead the church, look at verse 3, has to do with character, not drunkenness, not given to drunkenness, violent, gentle, quarrelsome, but instead it is as a person that is not a lover of money. This is hard to read because I would love for this to be given to the Roman government, given to institutions, 2,000 years ago. This is given to the local church, implying that the leadership of the church were doing these things. And here's the tragic of these churches. The tragedy of these churches is not that the leadership was doing these things. You know what the tragedy was? Is that nobody had a problem with it. Craziness is taking place. In other words, you're seeing leaders that are violating principles that they were not above reproach, people that they were struggling with being respected, with being hospitable, which we were able to convey the gospel, and simply the church was condoning over and over and over. Look at what it says. He has to be a person that manages his own family in a way that the children obey him. It's pretty obvious in this time in history there is not such a thing as we're going to get married and not have kids. That's a foreign concept in the Bible. So everybody had children. They must obey them. And he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. Why? Here is why. Because if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how then can take care of God's own church? What's the point? Here's the point. The point is that this individual must be a person that when you look at the circles and you look at that family circle with the red in the middle, mom and dad, and then children outside, and you look at the church, elders, pastors, deacons, in the middle, red, and then you look at the blue as the rest of the church. Look at me for a second. What he's telling us is that those circles unavoidably are one. It's a holistic view. Why? Because in this time in history, the church is not as structured. There's not such a thing as, oh, here's the church life, here's what I do, this is how I serve, this is how I give to the church, and then this is my family. Which in America, translation for us, means I have a public life, and then I have a private life. So I don't mind sharing, Sunday school or doing these ministries or whatever, but when it comes to how I raise my kids, how I do money and how I do relationships is my business, is my deal. Tracking what I'm saying? That's not the worldview of the Bible. The worldview of the Bible is that not only tells us who they are, but look at what they do. And what do? What they do, these elders, this is Peter chapter 5, elders, Peter says, among you, so they are among you. You may not recognize them, you may not think you need them, but God has called and gifted individuals to lead the church. He says, I appeal as a fellow elder. So I am one of them, Peter is saying. I am also a pastor. I'm an overseer. I'm a bishop. I'm a leader. Peter says, and my eldership is based that I witness Christ's sufferings. So it's not because someone appointed me or someone simply taught me. I took a class. It has to do with character. So we just read the character formation of these individuals, that eventually his character is reflected on how he is going to, Peter, experience the sufferings of Jesus. I don't have the time, but if you could, before you get into NFL football this afternoon, I will invite you to read chapter 4. Because chapter 4, the context of this statement of elders, that they are witnesses of Christ's sufferings, is a lot of suffering. 1 Peter is the book that helps you to navigate the theology and the concept of evil and suffering. Why crazy things happen in this world, this is the book to read. So apparently what he's saying is that we need this type of leadership to help us navigate those things. Be shepherds, this is what they do. You got to shepherd God's flock, not your flock, but God's flock. And you do it under care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing this honest gain. Again, he's writing to churches who they were not shepherding the flock, they were not watching over them, leaders that they were not willing to do that, and they were having dishonest pursuing. They were not eager to serve. So what do? Here's what they do. The leaders, they govern the church, and if you could, in your notes, put the word Isaiah 53. They govern, they lead through servant leadership, which, if you're honest this morning, there is no other way of leadership. Tracking what I'm saying? There is not other, in other words, servant leadership is one single word. If you divorce them, you have the opposite of this. So servant leadership, that's how you govern. Shepherding, and then they got to be able to teach. This morning, I want us to close with this. I want us to close about on how they do this. This is how they do it. They simply do it. Verse 2, same book, 1 Peter chapter 5. He basically says they have to do it by being eager to serve. I just told you, servant leadership. They have to be driven not by their position, not by their giftedness, not by their abilities, not because the situation demands someone to step up, and since they're qualified, they know, they have the experience. They have to be driven by a desire to serve. They have to be driven by the understanding this morning that if you fall into the privilege as a father or mother to be in the inner circle, because you might be the parent, the grandparent, and by default, you fall into that leadership position. The driving force of the inner circle has to be a life of service. And this is why I keep on coming back to marriage and to relationships, because single people get the privilege to choose in singleness someone that deals with this in a very godly driven. How do I know this? Here's how I know. Because when you look at your boyfriend or your girlfriend, the person that you're trying to date or you want to date, look at me for a second. The way she treats her daddy as a single lady is the way he's going to treat you when you marry him. And the way he treats her mama is the way he's going to treat you when you marry him. What's the point? Is that is one single experience. It's holistic in this view. This is why Peter, Paul, Timothy is telling us, if you cannot lead the home, if you are not a servant to your spouse, if you're not a servant to your members or to your children, you do not qualify to do this in public. For us as a church, I want us to simply think for a second what the struggle is for these churches. These churches were typically driven by what you and I look at police officers, law enforcement officers. there is a homicide and there's a body right there, just, the tragedy of a homicide. And typically the police shows up, they put the yellow, tape, and basically no one is allowed unless you pull out your badge and you said FBI, police officer, homicide. And based on the badge, you're allowed to walk into these privileges. The church in this time in history, they were going through badges. And the Jewish people will say, well, we are from Abraham. Here's my badge. Well, we are, from Apollos. We are from Paul. All these people always presenting their badges. Maybe at home, some of us were so quick to remind our spouses what you did to me. See, your mother always fill in the blank. We throw those badges at each other. And what we're looking at as a church, what we need is individuals, not necessarily that they don't have badges, because I think this is unavoidable. I think this is what makes us who we are, childhood, marriage, whatever. And I'm not condemning who you are. But what the Bible is describing, that someone in the transition, if you are in a place right now as an individual, either in church or in life, family nucleus, whatever the case may be, what the gospel does, it takes a badge and it literally changes or substitutes this badge for a towel. 2,000 years ago, the Son of God, God himself, put everything that he was and is and put it away. And Philippians chapter 2 says, being in equality with God, he did not consider that. But 2,000 years ago, he got into the upper room and he kneeled with a water container and a towel, and he went around the table. And this is what just blows my mind away. He included Judas, knowing that he was going to betray him, sell him. He included Peter. Oh, Peter, big mouth, short temper, and eventually deny him. He included Thomas. What's the point? That Jesus took the towel and gives us this universality of the gospel, that whosoever believes in me, whosoever confesses me. See, what you are joining is a group of men and women with. So as you date and you eventually marry, as you are married today, our lives must be modeled and represented by towels. And my heart's desire is that as a church, we are the community that, as we have seen people go through water baptism this morning, they're joining a church that beyond their theology, beyond their dreams to reach out the world for Jesus, we are known by towels among ourselves. And what Paul and Peter is telling us is that these towels begin at home, not simply at church. Begin on a relationship that is holistic among ourselves. This is the beauty, that we have to be examples. This is the beauty, that when you get the towel and you walk the rest of your life, whether it's a father, a mother, a child, a grandchild, or a leader in the church, and you're known for the towel, look at what it says. When, not if, but when the chief priest, who's the chief priest? Jesus shows up again, what are you going to get? If you are carrying the towel on that final day, you will receive a crown. So apparently what Peter is telling us is that there are no shortcomings between your badge and eternity. There is no shortcomings. The only way to go from who you are or who you think you are to a relationship with Jesus, not only in this life, but after this life, there is a towel in between. So as I pray with you, as I think about you this morning, let me ask you this question. Have you ever moved beyond just simply receiving Christ? I'm not against you receiving Christ, and if you have received Jesus in your heart, that means that the badge has been removed. Now your badge is Jesus. That's what Peter said, I am a witness of the sufferings of Jesus. Peter exchanged his own badge for the badge of Jesus. And the badge of Jesus was so apparently on that final day, this is what's going to happen. On the final day, Jesus is going to exchange a towel for a crown. I hope in this morning, Jesus is beyond just simply a prayer, simply a belief, simply something that you have as a doctrine in your heart and in your mind, in your heart, in your life. It begins with that, but it has to do the practicality. That maybe, this is why James, the half brother of Jesus, said, No one should aspire to be teachers because you will receive a greater condemnation. In other words, that if you're a Christian, this is what it means to be a Christian, is that you have lost your rights, and the only right that you have if you choose to become a member of this church is to serve and to die. I know that's not very attractive, but that's called church membership.